What if the place you stopped to rest was the last stop you ever made? Tonight, we open a file that's been sealed for more than a century, a case from the backroads of 1867 Missouri, where travelers vanished without a sound, and the only clue left behind was a sign nailed to a fence post that read, "Water and Shelter." No one knows how many people passed that cabin. No one knows how many never came back. But what investigators found beneath that quiet house would change how the county remembered kindness forever. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Your support helps us preserve these forgotten stories. So if you haven't already, like this video, subscribe to X Archives and stay with us until the end. Because this isn't folklore, it's history. And the truth about what happened on that lonely Ozark road is darker and far more deliberate than anyone imagined. The story begins with a promise: water and shelter. Tonight, we travel back to 1867, to the quiet backroads of the Ozarks, a place still recovering from war, where travelers moved through long stretches of wilderness with nothing but trust to guide them. Along that road stood a cabin with a hand-painted sign that promised two simple things: water and shelter. But for dozens who entered, it offered something else entirely. What really happened in that lonely Missouri cabin? Who were the men behind its doors? And how did they vanish without a trace? Settle in. Because this isn't folklore, it's fact, and it begins on a road where mercy ran out. In the year 1867, Missouri was still learning how to breathe again. The war had ended 2 years earlier, but the land hadn't healed with peace. Roads once meant for commerce were now marked by ruts, fallen trees, and the slow reclaiming touch of mud and vine. The Ozarks, rough and uneven, stood as they always had, quiet, self-contained, and indifferent to the affairs of men. Yet along these ridges and valleys, travelers still came, searching for work, family, or forgiveness. Between Springfield and the Arkansas border stretched a long, punishing road that traders called the Western Artery. Wagons creaked over it, horses stumbled through it, and the people who crossed it knew that daylight never guaranteed safety. Flooded streams washed out bridges, bandits still prowled backcountry bends, and towns were often little more than clusters of weathered cabins trying to remember prosperity. That stretch of land wasn't known for kindness. Inns were scarce, supplies unreliable, and strangers mistrusted. But there were places, few scattered, that offered travelers a pause. A porch light at dusk, a bucket of water drawn fresh from a well, a warm meal that didn't come from a tin. To those who rode through the Ozark routes, such places were a mercy worth remembering. One such stop sat near the border of Taney County, where the hills began to fold tighter and the trees thickened. A small house, plain but sturdy, stood a short distance off the main trail. Travelers learned its location by word of mouth or by the crude wooden sign hammered into a fence post: water and shelter. No promise beyond that, no fee listed. Those who stopped said the hosts were quiet but fair. A meal was offered, beds were clean, and the well never ran dry. For years, nothing about that little cabin drew attention. Men heading west paid for. A night's rest, left before sunrise, and seldom thought of it again. The few who stayed longer recalled the stillness, how sound carried strangely in the hollows, how the forest swallowed the road within sight of the front gate. There was nothing remarkable to speak of, except that travelers always remembered the well water, cold even in summer, drawn from a depth that seemed bottomless. This was the Ozarks after the storm of war, scarred land patched with quiet routines. Farmers rebuilt fences, merchants reopened ledgers, soldiers, both blue and gray, traded rifles for plows. Yet there was something uneasy beneath the return to normalcy. An undercurrent felt more than spoken. Too many graves without markers, too many names missing from rosters. Roads like these carried the weight of those absences. As the seasons turned, the traffic along that southern route grew again. Wagons rolled with cargo, travelers carried letters, and families pushed west toward newer promises. They all passed through the same narrow valleys, the same rough hills, and some, grateful for water, food, or warmth, found their way to that small cabin offering rest. No one could have known then that this unremarkable stop, half forgotten on the map, would later become one of the darkest crossroads in Missouri's history. The road kept moving, but what was left behind on that hill would not stay buried for long. The two men who ran the cabin at the edge of Taney County were known simply as Elias and Jeremiah. Their surname changed depending on who you asked. Some said Burnham, others called them Bender or Bell, but everyone agreed they were brothers. Elias, the elder by nearly a decade, carried himself with the precision of a man used to command. Jeremiah followed his lead in all things. Both had served in the war, in which regiment was never clearly recorded. Some claimed Union, others Confederate. In truth, no one could say for certain, and neither brother ever offered clarification. When they settled near the Southern Trail in the spring of 1866, the land was still raw from conflict. The brothers purchased a narrow plot, barely 5 acres, bordered by oak and limestone ridges. They built the cabin themselves, hauling lumber from a nearby sawmill, digging the well by hand. Locals remembered how quickly they worked, how the hammering carried across the valley for days. Within a few weeks, a modest structure stood. One main room, a smaller loft above and a lean-to kitchen at the back. The sign came next, roughly cut, painted in black letters that faded with rain, water and shelter, nothing more. It hung from a bent iron post beside the trail. Travelers began stopping soon after. For a small fee, Elias would offer a place to rest, a meal of stew or bread and water drawn fresh from the deep well. Jeremiah tended to the animals, repaired tack, and kept to the back of the house. They were polite, quiet men, businesslike, never pushy. Their home was clean, the food plain but filling, and the service steady enough to earn the trust of the road-weary. Neighbors described them as industrious, always working, cutting wood, mending fences, keeping their property tidy. They attended church twice during their first year, and occasionally purchased supplies from the general store, paying in exact coin. Their speech was soft, formal, touched by an accent that didn't belong to the hills. People assumed they came from farther east. What stood out most was their distance. They rarely lingered in town. No one recalled them sharing stories from the war or family names from back home. The brothers preferred solitude. Elias handled transactions, always polite, always brief. Jeremiah avoided conversation altogether. When questioned, locals dismissed it as habit born from hardship. The war had turned many men inward. Privacy was no sin in those years. It was survival. Still, there were odd habits. They fenced their land tightly, though few animals grazed within. They declined help with repairs, even from neighbors eager for work. The cabin windows were shuttered more often than open. At night, passing riders sometimes saw a faint glow behind the curtains, long after midnight. No noise, no movement, just light. In a county full of veterans and drifters, the brothers blended easily. 2 more men trying to start over where no one asked questions. Their business thrived through the next seasons, serving travelers who came and went with the turning roads. To most, the stop was an honest refuge. To others, it was a place that asked too few questions and answered even fewer. By winter's end, the cabin's sign had become a familiar landmark to all who rode that lonely stretch. Water and shelter. A promise simple enough to trust, and for a time there was no reason not to. Through the early months of 1867, the Southern Trail saw more movement than it had in years. Soldiers heading home, merchants hauling freight, families pushing west. The cabin near Taney County had become a quiet fixture along the route, a predictable stop between long stretches of wilderness. For most, it was a welcome sight. But by midsummer, that road began collecting stories no one wanted to tell. It started small, hardly noticed. A trader named Jonathan Pruitt, last seen in early May, never returned to Springfield. He was a familiar face, known for punctual deliveries and meticulous notes in his account book. When his wagon failed to arrive, his partner assumed mechanical trouble or illness on the road. Weeks passed before his name made the county register as missing. Then came a peddler from St. Louis, one of the few who traveled alone. His mule was found grazing near the river, cart empty, harness cut. Locals assumed theft. The Ozarks still had pockets of lawless men living off opportunity. No one connected the disappearances yet. The trails were dangerous and loss was part of travel. By autumn, the pattern grew harder to ignore. A family of 3 vanished on their way to Arkansas. They had been seen in town purchasing flour and lamp oil, then again by a farmer who swore they were headed south along the main road. Neither wagon nor remains were ever found. The sheriff filed brief notes, citing poor weather and the likelihood of washed-out crossings. Still, the talk began. Farmers compared stories at the mill. Teamsters mentioned unfamiliar wagons that never came back. Some traced their last sightings to within a few miles of the brothers' cabin. Others dismissed the link entirely. Too many miles of road, too many unknowns. By late November, the number of missing travelers reached 6. The county clerk's log showed gaps. Names entered and crossed through uncertain dates. Half-finished remarks like no report from family or possible robbery. There was no single investigation, only scattered inquiries. Families wrote letters to neighboring counties, searching for information that never came. It was a neighbor, a storekeeper named Weston, who noticed the strange coincidence first. In a worn ledger he kept for deliveries, several missing travelers had listed the same intended stop, water and shelter. He mentioned it in passing to the sheriff, not as accusation, but as observation. The sheriff noted it briefly, without action. The brothers had lived quietly, paid taxes, and kept no quarrel with anyone. The suggestion of wrongdoing seemed unfounded. Yet unease began to grow, slow but persistent. Riders reported passing the cabin and finding it shuttered even in daylight. A farmer delivering firewood said he heard hammering from beneath the house, though both brothers claimed they were mending the floor. Small details, easily dismissed on their own, began to form a faint outline of something larger. No one called it a pattern then. The word people used was coincidence, but the road was changing. Travelers rode faster, stopped less, and spoke quietly about the stretch of trail that never seemed to give people back. The sign still stood at the bend, weathered and unassuming, water and shelter. Those who passed by in the months ahead would remember it differently, not as comfort, but as the last thing too many travelers ever saw. The discovery came by accident. In late December of 1867, a postal messenger passing through Taney County stopped near the familiar sign that read, "Water and Shelter." He had expected to see smoke curling from the chimney or hear the faint sound of tools from the yard. Instead, the cabin was silent. The air carried no sign of life, no movement, no voices, no sound of livestock from the small pen behind the house. The front door hung slightly open. Inside, a single lamp sat on the table, cold and dry. A bowl of stew had hardened where it cooled. Bread rested beside it, half-cut, the knife still lodged in the loaf. Nearby, a chair was tipped backward, as if someone had left in a hurry but not in fear. The hearth contained ashes from an old fire. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, no damage to the locks. Everything appeared stopped mid-motion. The messenger called out several times, then circled the property. He found the barn empty, the well bucket still resting above the waterline. 2 horses, likely belonging to guests, remained tethered, thin from neglect. He waited an hour, expecting the brothers' return. When no one came, he rode to town and reported the scene. Sheriff Harrington arrived 2 days later with 3 men. They entered cautiously, treating the site as they would a robbery. Each room was inspected and inventoried. Bedding, tools, dishes, all accounted for. A few coins were found on the mantel, untouched. On the table lay a folded sheet of paper, blank, and an ink bottle half full. The sheriff noted it in his ledger. Abandoned residence, no immediate cause. When the men moved to the rear of the house, they noticed an uneven plank beneath the stove. It shifted under weight. Removing it revealed a narrow trapdoor, the edges worn smooth from repeated use. The opening led into darkness, and a faint odor seeped upward, metallic, damp, and unmistakably foul. They lowered a lantern. Below, a small earthen cellar extended beneath the kitchen. Inside were crates stacked against the walls and tools that did not match the rest of the household. Saws, knives, and hooks darkened with residue. The sheriff recorded the findings carefully, sending for a physician from the nearest town. When the cellar was emptied, they found what appeared to be barrels of salted meat, each labeled by date but without animal marking. The smell deepened with exposure. No bodies, no written explanation, only the unmistakable suggestion that the cellar had been used recently and hurriedly abandoned. Outside, the men searched the perimeter. Tracks in the dirt led east toward the tree line, already fading from winter rain. The brothers were gone. No wagon, no personal effects taken, no evidence of departure except absence itself. By dusk, the sheriff ordered the property sealed. Word spread quickly, drawing crowds from nearby farms. Some insisted the brothers had fled debt or theft. Others whispered of something worse. For the first time, the county had a reason to question what the cabin truly was. The well, the cellar, the empty chairs, all ordinary things, yet together they formed a silence that could not be explained. The sheriff left that night with a single remark recorded in his notes. House found vacant. Occupants presumed fled. Further inspection required of premises. It was the first official record in what would become the county's most enduring mystery. The brothers were nowhere to be found, and their home, still standing, still silent, had begun to answer questions no one had yet dared to ask. When the sheriff returned to the abandoned cabin days later, his focus turned from the cellar to the floor itself. The structure had been built solidly, hand-cut boards, iron nails, little sign of decay. Yet one corner near the main room showed subtle irregularities, as though something had been pried up and replaced more than once. They lifted the planks. Beneath the first layer of dirt sat a small tin box wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside lay a single item, a bound notebook, its leather cover worn smooth from handling. The edges were darkened, the pages unevenly cut. On the first sheet, written in precise script, was one word, guests. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Each line carried a date, a name, and a brief notation in the same measured hand. The earliest entry dated to March 1866, the most recent to November 1867. Between those 2 years were more than 30 names, each followed by brief comments written in abbreviated form. M. Gold timepiece. C. Pair boots. J.H. 2 horses. Occasionally a mark appeared beside certain names, an X drawn with pressure, cutting through the paper. The sheriff's deputy began reading the entries aloud, comparing them to the county's missing persons list. Within minutes the pattern became clear. Several of the ledger's names matched those recorded as vanished along the southern trail. Pruitt, the trader; Callahan, the peddler; the Hutchinson family of 3. Each corresponded to dates aligning with their disappearance. There was no mention of payments, no indication of lodging charges or debts owed. Only possessions listed, valued, and marked. It was less a guest book than an inventory. A physician assisting with the search examined the handwriting for changes, hoping to distinguish between the brothers. The style remained consistent throughout, precise, without hesitation. Whoever kept it had a practiced hand and the habit of record-keeping. Each letter leaned forward slightly, suggesting a formal education uncommon for men of the frontier. Further, pages revealed columns for items kept and items sold, though the details stopped abruptly 2 weeks before the cabin's abandonment. The last legible entry read only, "Traveler, St. Louis, rain coming X." No name, no date. The ink trailed off into a faint smear. The ledger's discovery changed the nature of the search. What began as a missing persons investigation became a matter of method. Every entry implied preparation, order, and repetition. There was nothing hurried or impulsive about it. Each guest had been noted, evaluated, and judging by the markings, disposed of with the same detached efficiency that defined the writing. As word of the find spread, the sheriff ordered copies made, and the original sealed as evidence. He wrote in his report that the ledger appears to constitute a detailed record of human subjects and property taken under pretense of shelter. The cabin itself offered little else, no letters, no confessions, no trace of the brothers' next move. But the ledger provided the first clear link between the missing travelers and this quiet, unassuming house on the edge of the Ozarks. Its pages told no stories, offered no emotion, only numbers, initials, and marks. Yet within that restraint lay its horror, a record so ordinary in form, so meticulous in detail, that it could only have been kept by men who viewed the taking of life as part of their routine. When the sheriff closed the book, he wrote a final notation in his own ledger. Evidence logged, December 28, 1867. Source, residence of Elias and Jeremiah. Purpose unknown, presumed criminal. The paper creased beneath his thumb, the ink barely dry. A record of records, one honest, one not, and the first undeniable proof that the disappearances had never been accidents at all. The well had always been central to the brothers' small trade. Travelers praised its depth, the purity of its water, the cool taste even in midsummer heat. In a region where drought and contamination were common, a reliable source like that was rare. After the discovery of the ledger, the sheriff ordered the well examined, not out of suspicion but to eliminate doubt. It was, after all, the one structure still untouched since the search began. On January 3, 1868, a work detail assembled at the property. The morning was cold enough to stiffen rope and hands alike. The pulley above the well creaked in the wind. Deputies removed the cover, a heavy wooden plank nailed in place. Beneath it, the water was dark and still. When the first bucket was lowered, it struck something soft before filling. The water drawn up was not clear. It carried a faint odor and a film that clung to the rim. The sheriff recorded the observation without comment. They began the process formally. A rope with a weighted hook was lowered, turned and raised. On the second pass, the hook caught on fabric. What came up was a torn length of canvas, frayed and discolored. On the third attempt, the bucket struck something solid. When raised, it carried with it a small, pale object that struck the rim and fell back into the water with a hollow sound. One of the men recognized it immediately. Work stopped. By afternoon, they had rigged a tripod to support a larger pulley and began retrieval in earnest. Over several hours, fragments of cloth, leather straps, and bone surfaced. The physician on site identified them as human remains, long bones consistent with adult males, some partially disarticulated. Several bore marks consistent with cutting tools. A piece of a jaw still intact with teeth was recovered last. Each finding was catalogued, wrapped in linen and placed into sealed crates. The sheriff made no public statement that day. Only his written report survives. Well excavation revealed remains of multiple persons, likely disposed over extended period. Nature of injuries suggests deliberate act. By dusk, the water was drained low enough to expose the stone lining. The lower portion was coated in residue, organic matter accumulated over time. At the bottom, embedded in silt, were personal items, buttons, a watch chain, and a brass buckle bearing initials later matched to one of the missing traders. The discovery ended any pretense of uncertainty. What had begun as rumor and coincidence became fact. The property was sealed as a crime scene. Guards were stationed overnight to prevent interference. In the following days, men from neighboring counties arrived to assist with the recovery. Each item was numbered, each fragment logged. The sheriff's notes, once sparse and uncertain, became clinical. Under findings, he listed, "Remains, minimum 4 persons confirmed." The well that had offered water to travelers for more than a year now held their proof. Beneath its still surface, the final evidence waited patiently for the light. By the week's end, the report reached Jefferson City. The case was reclassified from suspicious disappearance to confirmed homicide. The transformation was complete, speculation replaced by documentation, and a quiet roadside cabin now formally recorded as the site of deliberate killing. The water was never drawn again. The well remained open only long enough to remove what could be reached, then sealed with heavy stone and iron. It stood afterward not as a utility, but as evidence, the point where silence ended and the truth began to speak. When the well had been cleared and sealed, attention shifted to the outbuildings. 2 structures stood behind the cabin, a small shed for firewood, and farther back, a narrow smokehouse built of rough pine and stone. Its door was fastened with a wooden bar, the hinges rusted but intact. From a distance, nothing about it appeared unusual. Yet the sheriff's notes from that day record a faint, sour odor seeping through the gaps in the boards. The door was removed carefully. Inside, the air was thick with the residue of years of smoke and salt. Hooks hung from the beams, darkened with soot. Along the back wall stood a row of barrels and tin pails, their lids sealed with hardened lard. A layer of white ash covered the floor. The first crate opened contained strips of dried meat stacked in wax paper, labeled only by month and year. The texture was firm, the color uneven. To the examining physician, it looked unusual for pork or venison. Samples were taken for closer study. Next to the barrels were tools, cleavers, saws, and long-handled knives, all cleaned but worn from repeated sharpening. A wooden table stood in the corner, its surface scarred with cuts. Beneath it, wrapped in canvas, were bones, some split lengthwise. The physician identified several as human femurs and ribs. Other fragments bore parallel scoring marks, consistent with butchering technique. Each discovery was documented with methodical care. Deputies laid the implements on cloth, counted and labeled them. Every container was unsealed and emptied. Beneath layers of fat and salt were remnants of tissue preserved by cold weather. In several, partial limbs were found, skinned, segmented, stored as if for long-term keeping. What struck investigators most was not only the presence of human remains, but the order of the operation. The smokehouse was arranged with efficiency, hooks positioned by height, barrels labeled chronologically, waste collected in a pit behind the structure. Whoever had worked there had done so repeatedly, refining the process over time. By nightfall, the yard was lined with crates and tools awaiting transport. The physician in his report avoided speculation. His language remained clinical. Substances examined demonstrate morphological characteristics consistent with human tissue. Implements present indicate sustained and deliberate preparation. In the county courthouse, those words ended debate. There was no longer question of motive or misunderstanding. The evidence pointed to a deliberate practice, the systematic killing and processing of travelers for both robbery and disposal. The sheriff concluded his own entry with a line that echoed through later accounts. Activity within said outbuilding exceeds all expectations of criminal enterprise. Purpose not wholly discernible. The next morning, the cabin and its outbuildings were fenced off. Reporters from neighboring towns arrived within days, drawn by rumor and fragments of official statements. The sheriff refused interviews, citing the ongoing investigation. Behind the cabin, the smokehouse remained untouched until federal authorities arrived to remove it board by board. Each plank was numbered, each surface photographed. The structure that had once cured meat for travelers' meals was dismantled in silence. When it was gone, only the stone foundation remained, darkened by years of smoke and something else that would not wash away. The open space behind the cabin looked ordinary again, but every man who stood there that day noted the same impression in his reports. The scale of what had been done could not be measured by the smallness of the building. It had been precise, continuous, and far larger than anyone had dared to imagine. By the end of January 1868, the investigation into the cabin near Taney County had shifted from discovery to documentation. Sheriff Harrington, charged with assembling a full accounting, spent weeks compiling statements, lists, and examinations into what would become known as the official report of the Ozark murders. The report was methodical, 56 pages of names, measurements, and itemized findings written in the plain, factual tone of an officer determined to let evidence speak for itself. The opening section summarized the timeline: the disappearance of travelers between March 1866 and November 1867, the discovery of the abandoned property, the ledger beneath the floorboards, and the subsequent recovery of remains from the well and smokehouse. Each event was dated precisely, each location described by survey coordinates. No speculation was allowed. Only verified facts made it onto the record. The inventory filled 10 pages. It began with personal effects: 8 pocket watches, assorted metals, 13 rings, silver and gold, 5 knives of varying length privately marked, 4 pairs of boots identified by maker, 1 brass buckle bearing initials JP. Each entry was accompanied by a description of where it was found. The well, the cellar, or the outbuildings had the condition in which it was recovered. Next came the implements: 12 blades, 3 saws, 1 iron hook, a butcher's block, and 2 pulleys consistent with hanging or suspension use. Tools associated with normal slaughter work were noted but separated from those marked with unusual wear patterns. The section on remains was brief but absolute. The physician's report identified evidence of at least 11 distinct individuals, the true number possibly greater due to condition of recovery. The remains showed consistent trauma from cutting tools, the same instruments catalogued on site. Bone markings indicated deliberate separation rather than defensive injury. The phrasing remained clinical throughout. Witness statements followed. The messenger who found the cabin vacant described its state as orderly but abandoned. 2 neighbors confirmed seeing the brothers days before hauling crates toward the river road. 1 farmer reported lending them a mule, which was never returned. Another claimed the brothers spoke of leaving for Kansas. No one saw them again after the first snowfall. On February 12th, the sheriff's office issued formal warrants for the arrest of Elias and Jeremiah. Last name unknown or falsified. Notices were distributed across Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas, listing physical descriptions compiled from community recollection. Elias, approximately 40, tall, fair. Jeremiah, younger, slight build, scar above the left brow. A reward was authorized for information leading to capture. The closing portion of the report summarized conclusions without flourish. Evidence supports deliberate and organized acts of homicide and subsequent concealment of human remains for purpose of theft and disposal. Suspects fled jurisdiction approximately 4 to 6 weeks prior to discovery. Current whereabouts undetermined. Copies of the report were sent to state authorities, the local press, and law enforcement in neighboring territories. A duplicate was placed in the county archive. When the sheriff signed his name at the end, it marked the final moment of order the case would ever have. The evidence was preserved, the warrants issued, but the men themselves were gone. The trails they once used were washed clean by spring rain, their horses untraced, their property confiscated by the county. For all the detail the report contained, every numbered bone, every marked coin, it could not answer the only question that mattered: where the brothers had gone when the door of that cabin swung shut for the last time. The search for Elias and Jeremiah began as a coordinated effort between counties. Within days of the sheriff's official report, descriptions of the brothers circulated by telegram and poster. Local lawmen rode outward from Taney County, following what few tracks remained after winter storms. They reached as far as the Arkansas line before losing the trail entirely. The brothers had vanished cleanly. No spent campfires, no abandoned wagon, not even a stray tool to suggest direction. In February of 1868, newspapers began printing their own versions of the story. The Springfield Republican led with the headline, "Ghastly Discovery in the Ozarks. Brothers Flee After Atrocious Crimes." Other papers followed, each adding small distortions. Victim counts that grew by the issue, claims of cannibalism, reports of graves stretching for miles. Editors learned quickly that the story sold, and accuracy was secondary to spectacle. Law enforcement struggled to manage the consequences. Sightings poured in from 3 states, 2 men traveling under assumed names, 2 drifters selling watches at a trading post, a pair of strangers camping along the river. Each lead ended in error. In one instance, authorities arrested 2 veterans near Independence, only to release them the next morning after proving their identities. Another search party rode for days into the hills after rumors of smoke rising from a hidden camp, finding nothing but a burned-out logging site. By spring, the investigation shifted from pursuit to containment. Officials fielded letters from frightened travelers requesting safe passage through the southern routes. Stage lines rerouted to avoid Taney County entirely. Farmers along the border armed themselves, fearing the fugitives might return for supplies. The brothers, real or imagined, had become a living threat. Every unclaimed footprint attributed to them, every unsolved theft or missing animal folded into their growing legend. The press renamed them the Water Brothers, a phrase lifted from the sign that once promised water and shelter. Stories described them as cold, methodical killers who lured travelers with kindness before turning on them. Some accounts made them wanderers who preyed across multiple territories. Others cast them as spirits haunting the hills. The truth was already dissolving into myth. The sheriff continued filing weekly reports, each one shorter than the last. By May, the entries had narrowed to brief notations. No credible leads. Reports unverified. Despite this, public interest only grew. Pamphlets appeared in cities as far away as St. Louis recounting the crimes at the well. A traveling lecturer even claimed to have found the brothers' hiding place, charging admission to hear his fabricated account. The more distant the case became from fact, the more elaborate it grew in the national imagination. The details of the ledger, the well, and the smokehouse, each documented and verified, blurred under the weight of rumor. The county that had once tried to forget found itself marked on every map by the echo of that story. By the year's end, the manhunt was effectively over. The warrants remained active, but no officers still searched. In their place was something larger, harder to dispel, a myth shaped by fear and fascination. The Water Brothers were no longer fugitives in the eyes of the public. They were legend. Every stretch of lonely road in the Ozarks carried their name, and every traveler who passed through that valley looked to the trees and wondered if the story had ever truly ended. By the summer of 1868, with the manhunt stalled and no credible sightings in months, The focus of the investigation began to shift. Rather than chasing the fugitives, authorities started looking backward. Sheriff Harrington sent copies of the Ozark ledger and its transcribed entries to neighboring jurisdictions, hoping to locate matching reports of disappearances. Within weeks, replies began arriving. Quiet at first, then steady. Each contained the same unnerving pattern. From Arkansas came word of a way station abandoned 2 years prior, its owners gone without trace. Travelers there had also vanished along a heavily used route. A merchant's ledger recovered from that property contained initials beside dates and notations of goods, entries eerily similar in structure to the Taney County book. The handwriting differed, but the order, the phrasing, and even the coded X appeared in nearly identical form. Further west, Kansas officials reported a similar case from 1865 involving a roadside inn destroyed by fire. The property's occupants had escaped before authorities arrived, leaving behind fragments of charred bone among the ashes. Surviving items, a pocket watch, a silver chain, a set of boots, matched descriptions found in Missouri's recovered inventory list. Though the time gap was wide, the method was unmistakably familiar. Travelers targeted, robbed, and disposed of with efficiency. Investigators began compiling a comparative list. By September, they had identified 10 sites across 3 states exhibiting near-identical details: isolated lodging, missing guests, falsified names on tax rolls, sudden disappearances of proprietors. In several cases, neighbors described 2 men traveling together, one older, one younger, often using different surnames: Burns, Bell, or Barrett. Each time they appeared quietly, offered shelter to travelers, then vanished after suspicion rose. Federal marshals entered the case late that year. Their report, less narrative, more statistical, attempted to chart the movement of these unidentified men across the post-war frontier. The pattern stretched farther than expected. Records from as early as 1863, during the final years of the war, showed disappearances of soldiers on leave and displaced settlers along temporary encampments. In at least 4 of those cases, witnesses recalled 2 civilian laborers assisting with repairs or wagon repairs before the men disappeared. The investigators could not prove continuity, but probability replaced coincidence. Wherever commerce and migration met isolation, near border crossings, river fords, or trail junctions, similar traces appeared. The handwriting in the ledgers might have varied slightly, but the language remained the same: abbreviated names, listed possessions, and the same recurring X. An officer in Arkansas wrote succinctly, "We are not pursuing individuals so much as a practice." His conclusion, echoed in later reports, suggested years of calculated predation, an operation that moved with the roads themselves, exploiting the chaos left by war and the absence of central law. By the close of 1868, officials across multiple territories acknowledged the likelihood that the Taney County brothers were part of a longer continuum. Whether they originated in Missouri or arrived there after earlier crimes was uncertain. What remained consistent was their method: charm, hospitality, and erasure. The sheriff's final entry that year recorded a single observation: "Their work is not of madness or passion. It is of habit." That line would become the understated summary of the investigation. No sensational confessions, no bodies beyond those already found. Only a growing ledger of absence stretching across state lines. The evidence was no longer confined to one cabin or one well. It belonged to a pattern too broad to deny and too coldly efficient to misunderstand. The final credible sighting of the brothers came early in the spring of 1869, more than a year after the discovery at the cabin. It occurred near the White River crossing, roughly 40 miles south of Taney County. A stage driver named Wills reported picking up 2 passengers on foot who waved him down at a bend in the road. They carried minimal baggage, a single canvas satchel between them, and paid the fare in worn silver coins. Wills described the men as polite, soft-spoken, and deliberate in their manner. One, older, with a trimmed beard and dark coat, spoke for both. The other remained silent for most of the journey, glancing often toward the tree line. When asked their destination, the elder man replied simply, "Fort Smith." They disembarked before the river crossing, declining further passage. Wills remembered the moment clearly. The older man adjusted the strap of his satchel, nodded in thanks, and the pair turned east, walking toward the forest. The driver noted the event in his route ledger later that day, the entry routine at the time but invaluable later. 2 men, strangers, headed off-road near crossing. Polite carried nothing of note. When investigators reviewed Wills's account months later, they found corroboration from a ferry operator stationed downstream, who recalled 2 men matching the same description, attempting to purchase passage late that evening. They were refused due to high water levels. No one saw them afterward. A search team followed the riverbank and adjoining forest within the week. They discovered faint footprints leading into dense thickets, but lost them where the ground turned to stone. The area beyond was unsettled, a network of ridges and hollows stretching into Arkansas. No campsites were found, no discarded belongings. The trail ended in absence. No struggle, no sign of violence, simply disappearance. Through the remainder of that year, sporadic reports continued to reach the sheriff's office. Sightings in Kansas, then Texas, then as far west as New Mexico territory. Each was investigated, none verified. As time passed, the descriptions blurred. 2 drifters became 3. Ages changed. Names shifted. Evidence gave way to rumor once again. By autumn, the formal investigation was suspended. The warrants remained active but inactive in practice. The case files, now thick with unconfirmed leads, were transferred to the county archives. The sheriff's closing memorandum was brief. No further information. Suspects presumed deceased or fled beyond jurisdiction. The property itself was auctioned that winter. The cabin, stripped of evidence, was dismantled by the new owner and the land left fallow. Only the well remained sealed, its stone cap bearing a faint mark where the original rope once hung. In the following years, the brothers' names faded from official conversation. New crimes replaced old mysteries, and the roads of southern Missouri filled once more with travelers who had never heard of water and shelter. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point, a cautionary file pulled from the shelf when similar disappearances were discussed. The last trace of Elias and Jeremiah existed only in that driver's record, a single line in an ordinary ledger marking 2 men who stepped off a wagon and walked into the trees. Beyond that, history offered nothing more. No bones, no belongings, no witness to confirm their fate. The investigation ended as it had begun, with a note in a book and the silence of a place that refused to answer back. By the summer of 1869, the investigation had dissolved into silence, leaving only paperwork and unease in its wake. The brothers were gone, the evidence catalogued, and the cabin stood empty under county control. What remained was not a mystery to solve, but a problem to manage, a site that carried too much attention for too long. The county court authorized the seizure of the property that spring. An appraiser listed its contents: 1 cabin, 1 well, 2 outbuildings in disrepair, and an acre of adjoining land deemed unsuitable for farming. The total valuation was less than $50. In June, under supervision of the sheriff, a work crew dismantled the structures piece by piece. The boards were carted away for reuse. The smokehouse foundation was buried under layers of stone. The well, the site of the most damning discoveries, was sealed permanently with limestone and iron. A record in the clerk's book noted the date and action succinctly. Property closed to public entry. Well sealed under county order, June 12, 1869. The remains recovered from the site, 11 confirmed individuals and several partial sets, were interred together in the small cemetery north of town. The grave was marked by a single wooden post bearing no names, only the inscription "Unknown Dead 1868. Local residents avoided the burial after the first ceremony. No family claimed the bodies, and within a year the marker had faded to illegibility. In the months following the property's demolition, the crowds and newspaper men disappeared as quickly as they had come. The townspeople, once eager to speak of their proximity to a national story, grew tired of the attention. Merchants stopped answering questions from travelers. Even the mention of the Water Brothers became unwelcome. Fear turned first to fatigue, then to something quieter, a determination to move on. By 1870, the site had become a patch of overgrown earth, the boundaries of the old fence lost to brush. Hunters passed by without stopping. A few claimed to see strange lights or hear distant hammering at night, stories repeated in taverns until they hardened into local folklore. Parents warned children not to wander too far south, not out of fear of the brothers' return, but out of habit. The warning became tradition long after its origin was forgotten. County records from the decade that followed make only passing reference to the case. A line in the 1875 ledger reads, "No further expenditures concerning former Burnham property." Another entry lists the land as unclaimed. The case files, once thick and actively circulated, settled into the courthouse archive, their edges yellowing in the heat of each Missouri summer. For a time, the story lingered as rumor, retold by travelers and reshaped with each version. But as the years turned and the war generation faded, the cabin's memory folded into the landscape itself. The hills swallowed what had stood there, and the road reclaimed its silence. By the turn of the century, even the name Water and Shelter survived only in fragments of old newspapers and fading recollections. The land endured, ordinary again, while the crimes that once defined it dissolved into local legend. The county had moved on, content to let the earth keep what it had been forced to give back. Nearly 70 years passed before the story surfaced again. By then, the cabin, the well, and even the road that once led to them had disappeared under forest and farmland. The case of the Water brothers existed only in fragments, faded headlines, stray mentions in county histories, and the occasional rumor told without certainty. It might have stayed that way, if not for a renovation project at the Taney County Courthouse in the early 1930s. During the cleanup of an unused records room, workers uncovered a sealed cabinet wedged behind newer shelving. Inside were stacks of ledger books, bundled reports, and correspondence from the 1860s, documents assumed lost when the courthouse suffered flood damage decades earlier. Among them lay the original official report of the Ozarks murders, still bound, its ink surprisingly intact. The sheriff's inventory, physician's analysis, and statements from 1868 were all present. Most remarkable of all was the smaller leather-bound ledger, recovered from the brothers' cabin itself. Wrapped in linen and labeled simply, Evidence Item Number 4. The rediscovery drew the attention of Clarence Thornton, a local history teacher, with a background in archival research. Thornton began cataloguing the papers, comparing them with missing persons lists from the same period. What started as a curiosity soon developed into a formal study. He cross-referenced the names in the brothers' ledger with reports from Arkansas, Kansas, and Illinois, identifying at least 9 matches not previously recorded. Thornton's work reframed the old case in modern terms. In his early notes, he observed, "The method of record-keeping indicates intelligence and calculation inconsistent with crimes of passion." This was systemic. He published his findings in a 1934 issue of the Missouri Historical Review, calling the Taney County incident one of the earliest documented examples of organized serial homicide west of the Mississippi. The article reignited public fascination, and newspapers once again printed the brothers' faces, now as rough sketches reconstructed from witness descriptions. Local authorities, surprised by the renewed attention, permitted limited access to the surviving evidence. The recovered items, the ledger, the sheriff's report, and a handful of artifacts preserved in sealed boxes, were photographed and recatalogued under state supervision. Forensic experts, using contemporary methods, confirmed that the bone samples stored in jars were indeed human. The re-examination changed how historians viewed the period. What had once been treated as frontier rumor was recognized as part of a broader pattern of violence that accompanied post-war expansion. Thornton argued that the brothers exploited the disarray of Reconstruction, the lack of central record-keeping, the constant movement of people, to commit crimes that would have been impossible to trace at the time. By the late 1930s, the case had entered academic discussion. Students of criminology cited it as an early example of itinerant predation, and writers of true crime anthologies adopted the story, often embellishing it, but keeping the central facts intact. Thornton's report concluded with restraint. The evidence suggests intelligence without remorse, calculation without conscience. The men vanished, but their records remain, and through them we know what their neighbors never could. The rediscovered documents were stored again, this time in climate-controlled cabinets, catalogued and sealed. They remain there still, a paper trail spanning 70 years of silence. The crimes once buried by time and indifference now existed again in ink, exact and undeniable, preserved by accident and rediscovered by chance. In the early 2000s, the Taney County Archive initiated a comprehensive cataloging project to digitize its 19th century criminal records. Among the boxes selected for review was the preserved file on the Ozark murders, the same material rediscovered by Clarence Thornton more than 70 years earlier. The file contained the original sheriff's report, the brothers' ledger, and a small collection of evidence jars labeled simply "Human Remains," recovered 1868. Until then, the physical contents had never undergone modern forensic testing. In 2004, under the supervision of the Missouri State Historical Society, and with the consent of local authorities, forensic anthropologists from the University of Missouri were granted access. Their task was to determine whether any biological material remained viable for analysis, and if so, to confirm or refine the original conclusions drawn more than a century before. The results were precise and unemotional. Of the samples tested, collagen and trace DNA were recoverable from several bone fragments. Comparative sequencing confirmed at least 12 distinct individuals, 9 male and 3 female, aged between mid-teens and middle age. The original estimate of a minimum of 11 victims had been correct, though incomplete. The degradation of remaining material suggested a much larger total, possibly exceeding 15. Radiocarbon analysis provided an approximate sequence of deposition. The earliest remains dated to the spring of 1866, the same year the brothers opened their lodging, while the most recent aligned with late 1867, matching the timeline of the sheriff's investigation. Chemical residue on the bones indicated exposure to high concentrations of salt and smoke compounds, consistent with the conditions documented inside the smokehouse. Forensic toolmark comparison offered further clarity. Under magnification, cuts on the bones displayed identical serration patterns, implying that a single type of saw had been used across all specimens. Measurements matched the dimensions of a handsaw preserved among the evidence. The marks showed deliberate precision, parallel incisions consistent with practiced motion rather than improvisation. The ledger, re-examined alongside digital scans of 19th century property records, confirmed that the names listed corresponded with missing persons reported in Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas between 1866 and 1867. Statistical analysis of those entries revealed a consistent cycle, an average interval of 21 days between guests, suggesting a sustained, organized pattern rather than spontaneous violence. When the reassessment was published in 2006, its tone was measured and technical. The report concluded, "Material evidence supports the operation of a repeated and deliberate system of abduction, theft, and human disposal conducted over approximately 20 months. No indications of external participation beyond the 2 primary subjects have been identified." There were no sensational claims, no new suspects, and no revision of motive. What modern science offered was confirmation, a century of rumor replaced by verifiable data. Historians reviewing the findings noted that the brothers' case, once considered an anomaly of the frontier, reflected the vulnerabilities of a society in transition, scattered law enforcement, transient populations, and the lingering disruption of war. The Ozark murders were no longer just a grim anecdote from a lawless era. They were documented evidence of an organized system that had existed within the margins of ordinary life. The reassessment closed quietly. The samples were resealed, the reports archived, and the ledger returned to storage. Yet for the first time, every assumption, every suspicion from 1868 stood on solid ground. The science had caught up with the story, and the story had not exaggerated a thing. Today, the place where the cabin once stood is nothing more than an uneven rise on private land, hidden by oak and cedar. The road that once carried travelers south has long since shifted west, leaving the original trail to dissolve into undergrowth and memory. If you were to walk the ground, you'd find only the faint outline of stone. What remains of the Wells Capee, and a small bronze marker set by the County Historical Society in 1979. Its inscription is brief, factual, and careful not to linger. Site of 1867 homestead associated with unsolved frontier crimes, dedicated to the memory of the unknown dead. Few locals visit. The site sits off a service road behind a barbed wire fence, accessible only by permission. Hunters pass it without notice, and new residents often drive past the marker unaware of its weight. But for historians and descendants of those once listed among the missing, it remains a quiet point of return. A reminder that the line between recorded history and legend is rarely clear in places where time moves slower than the land itself. The case endures in university archives, law enforcement journals, and scattered museum exhibits on early frontier crime. It is often cited as one of the first documented examples of systematic homicide in post-war America, a moment when the expanding frontier met the limits of law. The details, preserved by accident and later confirmed by science, are studied not for their horror, but for what they reveal about the period: the fragility of trust, the ease with which isolation concealed brutality, and how ordinary signs of welcome, water, shelter, rest, could mask something else entirely. For the families of the lost, there was never closure. Records confirmed identities, but not fates. The remains buried under the single marker in the town cemetery are known collectively, never individually. Each name listed in the brothers' ledger ends with an X, an anonymous mark that outlived the men who wrote it. Over the decades, the story has shifted shape. Folklore tells of strange lights above the old road, or faint hammering in the distance after rain. Campfire tales replace the ledger with superstition, recasting the brothers as restless spirits guarding their secrets. Historians counter with evidence and dates, but even they admit that not every question can be resolved. Somewhere between those two versions, myth and record, lies the truth that the land continues to hold. Elias and Jeremiah were never found. No confirmed graves, no second ledger, no sign of survival or confession. The trail that ended at the river remained the last entry in their story. Yet their absence has proved as enduring as their crimes. Standing at the site today, there is no trace of violence, no sound except wind through the trees. Time has taken the evidence and left only silence. But it is a silence that remembers, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to remind anyone who stops there that some stories never close, and some names remain written only in the space between what is known and what will never be found.